at 11, and then at 3 o'clock there's actually walking in the footsteps of Pickett's charge and or the defense against Pickett's charge. So we've got a full slate for you today, and there are lectures going on in the tent next to the visitor center, so it's a full day. Pennsylvania Cable Network is recharging a battery. They wanted to know where I was going to be, and they're going to catch up to me. So at some point you'll see someone throw a wire and a mic on me. In the meantime, we're going to get started. And just, you know, what a beautiful day. And somebody asked me a little earlier, did I have nerves? And if you're ever a public speaker in a place like this, you always have nerves, but you live for those nerves because you learn how to channel them in a positive way. It's just, you feel so alive. And this is my favorite time of the year. Sort of like going to a homecoming. If you've ever been to a homecoming and you see people you haven't seen in years, it's like that. I recognize a lot of people in the crowd. A lot of times I recall first names, sometimes last names, and some of you we have long histories together. So I have an ambitious tour in terms of walking. I have time limits of about 2 hours, and covering a lot of ground and doing it in 2 hours is difficult. But that's going to be what I attempt to do. So there'll be times where I'll be thinking on my feet, do I want to go that far? And I look at the clock, no, I can't go that far. But what we'll do is we're going to pick some vistas. I've got one that's a really good surprise for you that you've never seen. A view that you've never seen. I had to work to get permission to get it. And that one, you know, my son and I like to play golf together, and he'll make a good shot every so often, and I'll say, that was worth coming out today. That was the price, worth the price of the ticket. I've got one view for you today that's worth the whole tour. And now, the theme that we're going to follow, I'll just give you a peek into my head briefly here, that my goal is to get you moving, to say less and keep moving. So this is the longest maybe the longest I'll talk in any one place, and then we're going to get going. Right up front, want to thank Erica Uzak. Where is Erica? Here. Okay, Erica was a ranger last year at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And so now at Gettysburg, and she went to Gettysburg College, and she was a history major. And so take advantage of her being here in the back of the crowd. Different times you'll see her. She's aware of where we're going. She has all kinds of things going on in the way of connections. Bob Horst is here too. And Bob, he wouldn't want me to probably announce this, but I will anyway. Bob is one of our senior volunteers here, and he went to Johns Hopkins for his master's. Guy is second to none in terms of just sharpness and sharp wits. He has a lot of knowledge of this park, and he's there as well along with Erica. So rely on them. They know where we're going, what we're trying to do. They know the story. So if you have questions, slip back and talk to them. They have connections to water. They have connections to everything. All right. Now, the basic theme that I'm going to follow comes from a letter from David Wills to Governor Curtin, Andrew Curtin. David Wills was selected as the local contact for the state and feds for the cleanup after the battle. He would hire the undertakers, he would hire the masons that did the beautiful work in the way of limestone and marble. He would organize the railroads, that is, coordinate with governors to make sure that the railroads didn't charge for caskets being sent home. There were embalmers here that were brought here, and they would embalm with arsenic or formaldehyde, and so there were a lot of young men sent home by rail. He worked with 17 northern governors to make sure that care packages from all over the north coming here were not charged extra fees, everything, there were free fares for all of the above. So there were many things that he did, and he planned the ceremony in which Lincoln participated in to dedicate what became one of the first national cemeteries. So he was the local contact for this disaster. And David Wills went around the battlefield with newspaper reporters and with Andrew Curtin after the battle, and they looked at the damage. And then Andrew Curtin went back to Harrisburg, and Wills wrote him and said, I'd like to purchase 17 acres of Cemetery Hill, fronting on the Baltimore Pike and extending to the Taneytown Road. Cemetery Hill was the apex of our triangle line of battle, and it was the key to our line of defenses. And then he added, it is the spot above all others. So what he was saying is, look, you just went around the battlefield with me, you came to the scene of the tragedy, and you've looked around, you see the ties that I have here as an attorney. And in my legal contacts, I can acquire prime real estate for this burial site. If you'll just go ahead and anoint me your local contact, I'll get it done. I'll acquire the key position on the battlefield for this cemetery that the states will contribute in creating, will become one of the first national cemeteries. So he was telling us that it was the key to the position and the spot above all others, and that's going to be my theme today. We'll venture off from that. We have some light stories, we have some serious stories, a lot of walking to do, but we're going to keep coming back to the idea that this is the key to the Union position. And so our first stop is going to be over towards the wall there to your left. So let me move through the crowd, get a lead on you, and then follow me. We're going to look at the west side of the hill first and then move our way towards the east side. I think they're in the back there. Okay, would two people be willing to come forward and open this picture? Would you?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Both of you would, and maybe stand right here. I'll move it sort of to the side here. And even,
Oh yeah.
yes, you've seen that.
Oh yeah. Look at you in the back.
Okay, we're on the west side of Cemetery Hill, and we said it's the spot above all others, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I brought out a really good picture, a rare one, taken shortly after the battle, and it was taken in 1863, showing the western side of this hill before the development. And of course, I'm not a purist. I understand that people have businesses and have to live, and I have good friends that live in the neighborhood down there. So the point, though, is at the time of the battle, it was even more open. And if it's the spot above all others, the picture helps emphasize that. Now, the photograph was taken from down in the area where you see the train station today and the hotel that's down there today, right in that area, looking towards you. And you'll notice the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse up in the upper left corner. We're going to stand right in front of that. It's over there to your left. Notice this opening here. It's like a cavity in the ground. The cavity is where the Quality Inn is over here. Isn't this incredible? The photograph is fun to interpret it. But that was an area where rocks were quarried. Of course, the area, there were a lot of stone roads and pulverized stone roads. So you get rocks from there for building houses and for stone walls and roads. And then the Taneytown Road, that runs from left to right in the middle. That's the Taneytown Road. And you can see there was a fence there at the time, not as refined as the one that was put here for the National Cemetery after the battle. You can see wagons, and looks like they're gathering up all kinds of grains. And you can see the crest of the hill and see a flag. That flag was where we just met, the Soldiers' National Monument. When Lincoln came to speak here 4 months after the battle, he would have seen a lot of mud, open graves, tarps partially covering them, axe picks and shovels lying around, caskets. It was a work construction site. And they were just trying to dedicate the cemetery before the winter set in, the same year as the battle. And so Lincoln came here to help dedicate it. For Lincoln, because of his assassination 2 years later, he never got to see the nice masonry work that's there now, the limestone and the marble and the granite. He would have seen a lot of mud, and he would have seen that flagpole. So that's what the hill looked like. And this comes from the Hanover Public Library. It's a rare photograph, and it shows the hill the way it would have looked at the time of the battle. We can go ahead and put it away now, but thank you. Now that ties into the idea of this being the spot above all others. If you go back and look at the accounts of both sides, they talk about this being the key position. The first person to have seen it would have been John Buford. You know, you don't fire the first shot in a battle until you determine what's the key position, a position that you can hold that'll allow you to stay for 24 hours. And so why was the position immediately spotted as the key one? I'll tell you a little story as a lead into that. A few years ago, this was in 1998 during the Bosnian conflict. And there were British soldiers that were stationed over there, and they were given a furlough, some time off. They had been stationed there where the Bosnians and the Kosovar people were in conflict in 1998. Some of you are old enough to remember that. They flew across in a military plane to the United States, across the Atlantic, and they called the park library, said, we want to see Gettysburg, and we don't want to just have a tour, we want to do some kind of interactive activity with the soldiers, something that's real time. So the ranger there said, well, yeah, I've got a busy day. This is sort of a surprise. When are you arriving? It was either Dulles or BWI. When are you going to be up here? All right, well, you're going to be here at 10 a.m. I'll meet you out at McPherson Ridge. And told them where to meet him, about first day of the battle. And the ranger gave them all the information Buford and Reynolds would have had that we knew they had up till 10 a.m. on the first day of the battle. And then the ranger left and did his errands, came back 2 hours later. The orders to these soldiers were, these British soldiers, come up with a plan on how you would defend Gettysburg. None of them knew the story here. So they looked around and they decided what the key position was and how you could sustain. They had done that sort of thing over in Bosnia to bring peace there. So it was their job to do that. And when my colleague arrived to hear their reports, they said, okay, if you want to hold this position 24 to 48 hours, you got to hold Cemetery Hill. So we recommend you start your defense west of town, and then if you have to, north of town, fight a defense in depth, and shift your Army's defense of Washington, which is 95 miles southeast of here, from Maryland up into Pennsylvania. You need to hold Cemetery Hill. And the main reason is it controls the roads. Comte de Paris, who wrote the book that all the Union veterans thought was the best, it was the Coddington of its day, published in 1886. Union veterans were fully behind it. Comte de Paris came out and visited Union soldiers at reunions, interviewed them personally, and the Comte de Paris said that this was the key position mainly because of the roads. The Taneytown Road, the Emmitsburg Road, which is the road just below it, and then we're going to be walking across the Baltimore Pike in a few minutes. All three dovetail at this hill. It's like an encasement is Cemetery Hill around these three roads coming together. So for the Union Army to transfer its defense of Washington from south central Maryland to south central Pennsylvania, they had to use those three roads. The Emmitsburg Road, the Taneytown Road, and the Baltimore Pike. And their point of nexus is this hill. So this is a tie-in point. You had to hold this hill. Theoretically, if the Southerners had gotten to this hill before the Union couldn't have stayed here. They would have fought somewhere else, but they couldn't have stayed here. If you want to stay here at Gettysburg, you had to hold this hill. If the Confederates had taken the hill, theoretically, they could have sent scouts down these three roads, determined their strength, morale, location, and then sent twice the numbers down and ambushed them separately and defeated them on detail on those roads. No guarantee that they would have been victorious, but it's a whole lot harder to fight when your army's separated en route to somewhere than when they're consolidated. So Cemetery Hill sealed the consolidation. So the hill itself stood out like a sore thumb. The photographs are going to bear that out. Some of the views I have will bear that out. But if you go to Little Round Top, it covers one road, the Taneytown Road. You go to Culp's Hill, it covers a more important road, the Baltimore Pike, but still only one road. You come to Cemetery Hill, it spans three roads. There's no hill on the battlefield, that's half the size of this hill. And so that's your visual for that. Now, much more I'd like to talk to you about, but I want the story to gradually build about how it's the key position. And so what I'm going to do is make my way through the crowd, and we're going to head back in the direction of the Soldiers' National Monument. Okay, so we've looked at, give as much context as I normally would on a daily tour to people it's brand new to. For how many people the story's brand new to you? Don't feel bad about that. Okay, a lot of folks are very familiar with this place, and this is our favorite time of the year. And Ed Everett gave the keynote speech 4 months after the battle. It was part of the ceremony that Lincoln participated in with his Gettysburg Address. And Ed Everett's opening words were, just sort of look around, look towards the mountains, and just kind of squint your eyes as I quote him. Gazing across these broad fields, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice. And he had given the dedication for the monument at Bunker Hill. He had spoken at a number of George Washington birthdays, 4th of July's. After Daniel Webster's death, Ed Everett was considered the #1 orator in the country that you wanted for your patriotic event. And he agreed to speak here, and he was the keynote. Went on for 2 hours. Orators were known, though, for that. As president of Harvard, at one point, he was steeped in rhetoric, teaching rhetoric, which included Shakespearean theatrics, so he was animated, and there were gestures, and a handkerchief that he would use to wipe his forehead periodically, and he made a number of good points along the way. But the first thing he did was point towards the mountains in the distance, and you can see that. Now I want Bill to come forward, if you would, and maybe somebody else to help him. I'm going to open up this photograph, and I want you again to see how it's the spot above all others, how it's, at the time, it was not partitioned off, and we'll pivot around so everybody can see it, the camera can get a shot of it. But this is a photograph looking from the Soldiers' National Monument, and there's an auger at the base, so they're apparently trying to put in a pedestal at that point. This is after the battle, and in the background, or to the west, notice how open it is without the trees. Union artillery would have dominated from up here. You know, give you an idea, I try not to use too much math because eyes can glaze over, can lose focus. But I saved these zingers for the right moment. There were only 5 artillery pieces on the summit of Little Round Top. There were only 5 artillery pieces on the summit of Culp's Hill. Between Cemetery Hill and its southern ridge, Cemetery Ridge, 178 by the 3rd day. So that's why when Longstreet said to General Lee in an argument they had the morning of Pickett's charge, 159 years ago today, he said, General Lee, no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. He said it would take twice that many men, and even then the issue would be a doubt. They were arguing about this hill. That was the objective of Pickett's charge, to dislodge the Union from this hill, hit them down on the lower slope, isolate the troops here, try to get them to fall back down the Baltimore Pike. They were trying to dislodge them from this hill. And they were arguing about the position of Cemetery Hill. So this gives you another visual to sort of help reinforce the openness of the hill at the time. Now let's shift a little bit to memory. I want to bring in several things. You know, this hill, it has the distinction of being known all over the world because of not only the National Cemetery, but Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And parts of it have been used all throughout American history. And I'll elaborate some on that. Before we walk up to where Lincoln spoke and address what he had to say, I want you to look over to your left, and you'll notice an early version of Lady Liberty. Before Lady Liberty came over from Paris to Ellis Island in 1886, there were other Lady Liberties, and that's one above the New York State Monument. And then there's an early version of Lady Liberty above the Soldiers' National Monument. That's at the equidistant point, the center of the semicircle of graves. And so Lady Liberty is central to the Gettysburg Address. Did you know that? She's actually the central part of the Gettysburg Address. So I want you to take a mental picture of both of these Lady Liberties. And when you go around the battlefield, you'll notice variations on her. There's a variation on her flying over the Pennsylvania Memorial, and that would be Victory. And there's a variation of her, we might call her the Republican Mother, for instance. That's what they called her in the early years of the United States. Over at the Alabama Memorial, if you go there, she's standing there and she's got a flowing dress, and there are two soldiers. One is wounded, just below her one is wounded, and the other is trying to go forward, and she's giving him courage and pointing towards Little Round Top. Have you seen that one? Or if you go to the New York monuments across the battlefield, look at the seals on the monument. And there's a Lady Justice holding scales. Or there are also women holding swords, which would be the sword of the Spirit, or truth. And it's almost like finding Waldo on the back of a cereal box. Once you're aware she's here, she's everywhere. She's everywhere. People will ask me about women's history. Women are central to how the battle was remembered, over and over again, including the Gettysburg Address. So one last look then at these two early versions of Lady Liberty. Let's go over to see where Lincoln spoke it. See how he tied it all together. In what is considered the local Evergreen Cemetery, which was only 8 years old at the time of the battle. The iron fence was put here in the 1930s. It was recycled from Washington, D.C. Someone there knew a superintendent here, and they said, it's going to be scrap metal unless you can use it. So it was brought here in the 1880s, put along the Baltimore Pike. That didn't work. They moved it here in the 1930s. And it was used to divide the local from the National Cemetery, to keep people from wandering back and forth and to draw clear jurisdictional lines. At the time of Lincoln's speech, obviously there wasn't a fence, so respectfully take out your mental erasers and erase the fence. And how many of you have heard me over the years talk about my wife, the art teacher? Okay, she's in the audience now. And she went out on one of my tours years ago and she said, I really liked it, but she said, you're left brain. She's very analytical. And she said, remember, she's an art teacher now for 29 years, and she's the Biglaville High School art teacher just north of here at the public school. She said, take time to paint the picture. There are always right brain learners in your audience. And she said, there'll always be someone who thanks you. And I've never had a program where that didn't happen, where somebody didn't thank me afterwards for attempting to paint the picture. So that's what I'm attempting to do, is to affect the right brain learner. So take out your mental erasers, and I would say don't erase the tombstones, because many of these tombstones that have been put up over the last 150 years have dates on them that indicate that the people that are buried there were alive at the time of Lincoln's address. And if we go with the 20,000, 18 to 20,000 figure, several newspapers said there were that many people here, the odds are a good many of the people that are buried here were standing not far from where they're buried. So I just squint my eyes and imagine that where their markers are, they're standing there. Women with crinoline dresses, flowing dresses that go out, hoop skirts, in many cases dark colors. The word mela in Latin, from which we get the word melancholy, means black. So the color for grieving would be dark colors. You would have seen a lot of darker colors here, browns and blacks. And the women would have had, if they lost a husband or a son, as we try to paint the picture, a veil over their face. Widows would wear that black for a year and then wear lavender for a year. Victorian people that we're about to hear Lincoln speak to, they were very caught up in dying a perfect death. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s had raised questions about purgatory and about its existence. Victorian people, that's the culture that lived to fight the Civil War. Sometimes we call them antebellum or sentimentalism. sometimes early Republic, but more broadly across both sides of the Atlantic, we call it Victorian culture. Because they weren't so sure about purgatory, that is, sometime after you pass away, where you'll gradually pass to a good place. Victorians were fearful that the clock stopped at the moment that you died. So everything you wanted to achieve to get to a good place, heaven and hell were real places, meant you had to end well. Because whatever you ended with here carried over into the next world. It carried on into their charges. They thought in terms of, you have to, if you're going to die, you have to die perfectly. The meter stops running after you die. So they became obsessed. Read Drew Gilpin Faust's book. She's the president of Harvard. She wrote about this, a book on suffering, but it's on the obsession that Victorian culture had with dying the perfect death. They were so worried about things not being perfect that when somebody died, let's say mom died, and the family gathered around her after she died, they watched her pass away, the family would prop her up out of the bed, would all stand around her, hold her up, and take a picture with her eyes open because she was sleeping. The New Testament rarely refers to death as death. It's sleeping and it's resting. The idea is it's not final. Lincoln was aware of that, and he addresses it in his Gettysburg Address. He knows about their obsession, their perfection tendencies towards dying perfectly to assure a good place hereafter. So taking the picture of her is a picture of her sleeping the way she's going to look one day when her life continues in another realm. The Victorians also put slabs over graves. If you look around, if you could afford it, some Victorians put huge stone slabs. That's because some anatomy schools would hire people to wait at a funeral, and after the funeral was over and the crowd's cleared, they would go in and dig up the fresh dirt, exhume the person, take them under the cover of darkness into an anatomy school. See, it was illegal to operate on a cadaver unless the person was a criminal and had no rights. And so for a certain fee, the bodies would be exhumed. Medical students would come out after midnight, look at the anatomy, operate, and then before daylight have the person reburied again. Victorians worried that if they're, I'm an organ donor. It says on my license that I tell them, wait, make sure that I'm gone first. But they were worried that if even, it was just a hint or a rumor that their body could be used for science after their death, and if the organs weren't put back in place, they were uptight that it would affect the hereafter. They cut locks of hair and wove it with their grandfather's hair and created hair weaves and put them in what we would call shadow boxes up on a mantelpiece. They were the first people to have funeral parlors. Today we think of pizza parlors and ice cream parlors and funeral parlors. There was no such thing as a funeral parlor prior to the Victorians. They just started. Again, you got to end perfectly, and the person might not actually have passed away. You got to be sure about that. But they would put formaldehyde and arsenic in them, put them in a casket, seal them, have a glass window around the face, put them on display in the parlor, surround them with flowers. The Victorians were first to do that to cover the smells. That's where we get the idea. And family could come in, loved ones, friends, and observe the body for maybe up to a week. People in previous centuries didn't do that. They would bury somebody the day that they died. So they went through these rituals. Women wearing black dresses for a year, then lavender for a year in public if they lost a husband. They were very uptight about making sure that this person died a perfect death so that they wouldn't interfere with him entering into a good place here thereafter. But keep that in mind. Pick up Drew Gilpin Faust's book. It's probably one of the best that pulls together a lot of these ideas. So Lincoln understood that uptightness and he addressed it. Now, when Lincoln spoke to these 20,000 people, the platform was probably very near where the flag is. And somebody came up to me recently and said, Troy, a new article is going to come out soon and it's going to be a little different than that. And I said, well, I'm always open to new ideas. So what I'll say, generally speaking, very near the flag. And the crowds were largely looking towards us or up there, looking down. and Lincoln sat there with other dignitaries on the platform. Now, when he went to speak to them, he did what all leaders must do, and that is provide a vision, a way forward. I've done tours here from time to time when there's a funeral going on in the local cemetery. You can see people grieving, and you can see the minister. You can't climb into their mind, but you know this must be beyond them. They feel maybe inadequate, that they have to say something that gives this person hope. And it makes a tour like this very real when you see the green tent and the limousine. That's happened, or the Hertz, that's happened more than once here when I've given tours here. But Lincoln would have felt the burden of taking people past this moment. Have you ever heard of being stuck in a moment, prisoner of a moment, a holding pattern, and you can't move beyond? That's why you have to keep moving. You keep moving, that puts it behind you. Keep moving. So Lincoln's got to help people go forward, whether he feels up to it or not. And according to John Hay and John Nicolay, two of his staff, they said he had the pox here. And it's possible he had the smallpox, but I rather think he had the shingles. And he was pale, clammy, and when he sat down on those wooden chairs, he probably went into orbit. The pain would have been intense. He lost a son a year earlier, Willie. He and Mary Todd had him embalmed with arsenic. They exhumed his body 3 times over the last year until the chaplain talked them out of doing that again, that this is just a shell of Willie, he's no longer there. That gives you a peek into the grief. And he wore a little blue crepe. You've seen crepe paper at a ball and it's hanging over the punch bowl. He had a little blue crepe around the base of his black stovetop hat. People knew that was for Willie, and he was grieving for Willie. The second thing that he had to do, he had to give people a vision, a way forward. You got to move forward. But he also did so in a unique way through allegory. To understand the Gettysburg Address, you have to decode it. It's encrypted. It's an allegory. Now, an allegory is where there's something going on at one level, but then there's another frequency below it where there's a deeper message. Really good Hollywood directors understand this. You'll watch a 2-hour movie, but then there'll be one moment, a director's statement through an actor. The whole 2-hour film exists for that one statement to be made about society by an actor at a given moment. And so the movie's about one thing, but really there's a deeper societal message there. Probably the most famous allegory in American history is Pilgrim's Progress. There's this whole journey going on, but underneath, over and over and over, if you're tuned into the frequency, it is spiritual journey, spiritual journey. The allegorical hidden message for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that it unlocks it for us is understanding that in symbolic language, he was talking about the cycle of life. New birth in spring, maturation of life in summer, twilight years of fall, death in the winter, and new birth in spring. And not just the cycle of life, but the cycle of life of the country. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, if he wasn't speaking in allegory, symbolic language, if he was just speaking directly, he would have said 87 years ago the Declaration of Independence was signed declaring all men are created equal. And many years ago in the 1980s, I had the good fortune of working in Independence Hall and giving tours at the Liberty Bell, and giving tours in Independence Hall with the inkstand, with the feather in it. You know, of course the feather was a replica, but the silver inkstand that Washington and Madison and Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and Hamilton and Hancock, they signed the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution was written and signed in there too. And I even had an opportunity with white gloves to put the inkstand away in a safe at night. So that's, you know, this is an incredible story here that we're going to tie in. He said 77 years ago instead of 87. Why? Because his allegory, symbolic language, is about the cycle of life. And he was quoting Psalm chapter 90, verse 10. People would have read between the lines here, which says, a person's lifespan is 70. If by reason they live 80, they will soon fly away. He was suggesting the country's lived a full lifespan since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth. This is a reference to the ancestors. When I think of a special day like July 4th, my memories go back to my father and my mother and my grandparents, and all of you are this way. Think back to them now. They go back to my son and my wife and the people you hold dear. And then the ancestors are people that came before us. The reason why we celebrate Memorial Day and July 4th, it bonds us together. We're remembering the people that came before us, and we're walking in their footsteps. They handed us a baton. Sometimes they're referred to as a cloud of witnesses. We always feel like they're nearby. And every culture has their festivals to remember the people from the past. And it enriches our life. Lincoln said, if you want to know the health of a society, look at the cemetery. That tells you how well they remember people who came before them. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Now, I don't have time to get onto a tangent here, but Lincoln was the first president in American history to refer to our country as a nation in the way we would define it today in a modern sense. In his inaugural address 2 years earlier, more than 20 times he referred to our country as a union. And he called the Union Army the Union Army. But he changed courses in the Gettysburg Address, and there were people that would have heard what he was saying. He talked about a nation, and he used it 5 times, and he did not call us a union, he called us a nation. And so what he was suggesting, that's part of the vision going forward. What had happened was, with the advance of rail and telegraphy and canals, remote areas of the country were connected. You could communicate in 5 minutes by telegraph from Boston to San Francisco and back, whereas it took 14 weeks before the telegraph. The country was becoming small, and iron-strapped in every direction allowed a stronger central government. We were shifting from a union where there were states. If you were from Massachusetts, your country in 1860 was Massachusetts. Your history, your genealogy went back to Plymouth Rock in 1620. Or Virginia, your history went back to Jamestown in 1607, 250 years. The United States as a nation was a new concept, only 87 years old when Lincoln was speaking. That would change during the Civil War, a shift because of technology in large part, a stronger central government where the states are firmly under the subheading of a national government. We're watching something similar to that now, and you and I have been experiencing turbulence from this. We're too close to it to know where the balance is, but we can acknowledge it and articulate that what the railroads and telegraph did to unify the country and bring a stronger central government and a national unity in the 1860s, that's what the internet and other forms of communication are doing in the world now. The internet, you can communicate with people like never before. You can send a telegraph, you could send an email from here to any other part of the world, and there's no State Department to interfere with that email. If you send it by snail mail before the internet, it may never get to that person in certain countries. The communications are instant now. Half of all university classes are now online. They're international, global classes. And boundaries are softening because the internet is connecting everything. It's blurring the lines between a national government and a global world. And where is the balance between our national identity and global commitments? We're too close to it to know. But that turbulence that we're experiencing now is not unlike what they felt then, people that lived in the 1860s, created by the railroad between their states no longer being their country and looking to Washington. Or at least there being a mutual relationship that was stronger. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. You saw a picture of her. This is right brain, Lady Liberty. Liberty was a muse. We get the word amusement park, and we get the word museum from that. The ancient Greeks in particular, believed a muse gave birth, creative birth to the literary arts, to the visual arts, to languages, to history. So there were muses for all of these. So let's say you're painting one day and you're not achieving anything, and I watch an empty canvas sit there for 8 hours. And I come back several hours later and it's still an empty canvas. And you have the equivalent of writer's block as a painter. I come back the next day and in the same amount of time you've turned out 5 paintings. I say, what's the difference? You say, a muse is with me. There's a wave of inspiration. There's no blockages. I'm able to paint freely. So liberty is the highest muse. Liberty and freedom. Giving birth to freedom and giving birth to liberty. So our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. And she gave birth to a child. All men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, there's your birth again, and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to visit a final resting place. This is sort of the wilderness motif. Where do we go from here? The crowds could look to the side of Lincoln and in some cases beyond him, and they could see the axe and picks and shovels, the caskets, the dirt, the open pits, the tarps partially covering those areas. All of those were symbols of death. Many of them out here, they had lost a son, a father, a brother. Where do we go from here? There was despair. The war seemed to have no end. At this stage in the war, according to some figures, there were 360,000 dead. And the war, that's just amongst the armies. Before the war was over, a couple of million civilians, that many civilians died. So there's despair. And Lincoln is telling them essentially, all men are created equal, has lived a full lifespan, 87. And the child now is stillborn. But he doesn't leave them in that despair. He gives them a way forward. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. There's your cycle of life. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And you can mess up a perfect speech by saying another word. But here's my attempt to bring some quick analysis. The first birth that lasts in this allegory of the life cycle, birth, death, rebirth. The first birth lasted 87 years, 87 years, from the Declaration to the time of the Civil War. The child was all men are created equal. The new birth that he's calling for, that is the phoenix rising up out of the ashes, is all people are created equal. The first birth is all men. The new birth is all people, of the, by the, for the people. So it's a much broader vision, isn't it? With sacrificial death for a righteous cause comes new birth. They gave the last full measure, like seeds planted into a ground. You and I are the new birth. We're the growth that came out of it. We're part of that vision. The original birth was also conceived in liberty. The new birth was conceived in freedom. 2 weeks after this speech, Lincoln gave a dedicatory speech in Washington, D.C. of Lady Freedom. Many of you know that the Capitol Dome in Washington was under construction during the war. Lady Freedom sat on the ground at the base of the Capitol, and Lincoln walked past her daily. 2 weeks after this speech, he would help dedicate her with another speech. So he'd been contemplating freedom. And the abolitionists were talking about freedom after the war rather than liberty. And so you say, Ranger Harman, you're parsing words. What's the difference between the first birth being conceived in liberty and the new one being conceived in freedom? And the difference is, liberties are your basic rights. Freedom is more collective. That is, if you're not free, I'm not free either. I'm not free until you're also free. It involves a greater policing and responsibility with an internal compass of yourselves to make sure your rights don't infringe on others. So you have a right to freedom of speech, but not to yell fire in a crowded theater. You have to police yourself to make sure your rights don't take away the rights of others. That allows a new birth of freedom. You have a right to life, liberty, and property, says the Fifth Amendment, and it can't be taken away without a due process of law. A trial jury of your peers, presumed innocent till proven guilty. Can't afford an attorney, the state will appoint one. Have your rights read at the scene. There's a whole list of things that must happen to make sure it's not easy to take away your life, liberty, and property. You have a right to life, liberty, and property, says the Fifth Amendment, but with freedom, not human property. So Lincoln is drawing that line, and that's how the new birth occurred. When President Bush talked about Operation Iraqi Freedom, and we saw pictures of blue thumbs and people voting for the first time, each time that word freedom was used, they were hearkening back to this speech. And we've been working out that idea of freedom all the way up to this day. We're still on that vision. And that speech made this hill the spot above all others globally. Now I could end on that, but I still have a lot more to show you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to leave Lincoln in the crowds here, and we're going to make our way across the Baltimore Pike. Law enforcement's going to help us cross over, and I'm going to take you right to that special view right away. Okay. He's really busy, but
Well, I'm not saying he told me 12:30 or anything. But
oh yes.
you're going first, right? Tell me when to come on.
Well, I'll just say something here very briefly. If we got most everybody here, I'll go ahead and start talking, and
They're
I'll
climbing ahead.
still coming up there. And you know, Confucius said thousands of years ago, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And so we're not being shot at today, we're not physically in the battle and shrapnel's not flying around us, but we are doing some of it, we're walking it. And it's one thing to say this is the key position and it covers 3 roads and it's expansive and it controls the Baltimore Pike, all those different things. It's another thing to walk it. That burns it into your memory. Now, this would not be possible. Remember I told you at the beginning there was one view that was worth the price of the ticket? You know, sort of the whole excitement of the tour. I had several things excited to talk to you about, but I thought, oh my, I can't wait to get them here. For people like myself, this is the sort of things that, in a secular sense, that we live for. And this view is made possible by the Civil War Battlefield Trust. The trust, who's much bigger than the Civil War now. They're saving sites across the expanse of American history. But one of the key persons to making the trust work and saving our past is Gary Adelman. He's a licensed guide here, and he's one of our first citizens here at Gettysburg. This place would be very different without Gary. This place would, I remember when he owned his own business in town, so he's done a little bit of everything. But Gary makes things happen. So he said, yeah, he wrote me an email back, yeah, I'm busy, but yeah, you can go up there, and the trust, Battlefield Trust, made this property possible. They purchased it, and they've done so much more across, you know, a wide expanse of Battlefield. But Gary's going to talk to us about this property as it relates to big picture, what they're doing. He has some things he has to say. So give him a round of applause in advance.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, and I know it surprises everybody here. I have some things to say. 2, thanks so much for being here for Gettysburg 159. As you can see, I'm super tired from all the work that we've been doing for these last couple of days, and we're really happy to have you here on American Battlefield Trust property. It's really cool. Just real quick before I say anything, how many of y'all have stood here before? Very small percentage, and as I assume you've already learned from Troy, most people think the attack and the Union line on East Cemetery Hill was back there where the park starts. But no, as you can see from the markers here, as you can see from the stone wall you just walked up next to, that is actually the Union line at this point. It is a thin Union line. I don't know what Troy already said, but at this point the Ohio soldiers talked about them being 6 feet apart. And that is not a line at all. That is almost skirmish line at this point. So we knew that this ground used to look different. In fact, if you took this monument, this is the 107th Ohio right here, and looked at this in 1904, here's what you would have seen, okay? It was a very open scene. I'll go around twice for this, okay? So it is our goal, the park's goal, the American Battlefield Trust goal to have you be able to come here and to the degree possible see what the soldiers saw, okay? So when this property, there was a house right here, and I mean right here, it was right next to the markers, came up on the market in 2012, right away we thought, oh, well, this would kind of be a hole. There's nothing around it preserved. So it made me wonder, well, who owns that? These woods right behind me here, and it turns out it was the Gettysburg Municipal Authority, the same people who own the water towers over there. I knew that those woods are no practical use to almost anybody. We met with the municipal authority. They said they would divest themselves of the woods behind me here. And at that point, once we had that commitment, we engaged with the owner of this house. You know, people only sell to us if they want to. We can't make anybody sell their battlefield tract to us. And happily, they were interested in it, and we paid the fair market value, acquired the house in 2013, cemented that deal in 2013 as well. And at least for now, we have a little bit more of East Cemetery Hill saved. I didn't stop there. I, of course, asked the municipal authority, what about those towers? Which is a Star Wars quote, by the way. And they said, we have no better tower anywhere. So the big one behind this one, they're not going to divest themselves of that, but we're happy to have this. Hopefully someday, this tract and this tract here will come into the park. Right where we stand here, we're on the Union line. The Confederates came from here. Louisianians coming straight from that direction and went from this wall to the next wall to the next wall, as I imagine you've already heard, okay? So they had to go a little farther than most people think, okay? Now, one thing that I am curious about, we've talked to the park a few times about this, by the way, the National Park Service is our best partner. We can't do what we do without both the funding and the participation of the park, is whether we should thin these trees. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen the picture taken in July of 1863 looking here, but it looks a lot like this. There is about one tree on that tract behind me. We could clear the trees, it wouldn't be cheap, but you'd be able to see. But then what would you be able to see? Houses, the middle school, and the elementary school. So I'd be curious to know, offline of course, what you would do. Because this is a tough one. Do we thin it just a little bit so you can't see it in the summer? Do we get rid of all the trees like it was at the time? We like to restore it so we see what the soldiers saw, but in order to do that, we have to have them see a whole lot of other things. And I imagine the park, if they ever take it into their holdings, you know, might want to consider, you know, some selective clearing and maybe a safe trail where people can access it without having to walk up that hill. Nobody got hurt, did they? Because the trust is not responsible. Anything else you wanted me to cover, Troy?
That's beautiful.
This is the first tour Troy and I have ever given together in 27 years. I'm honored to be here on this battle walk. I hope you enjoy the rest of it. I hope you enjoy the rest of 159 and you have a meaningful July 4th tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Tim is doing my bidding somewhere else. I got him to do my laundry and stuff.
You know, John Batchelder, the first historian of the battlefield, who helped bring in a lot of the first monuments and corresponded with veterans and kept the earliest records and helped some of the first pulverized roads be put in the park and so on. That same John Batchelder, one of the founders of the park, said that from Cemetery Hill, a view of the whole battlefield could be had. And I told you at the beginning, I'm not a purist. I understand people have lives here and they have memories just as dear as our national memories. But I would like to see at least a computer simulation of what it looked like. And we're getting that view gradually by acquiring some property here and there where it's appropriate. But I would like to see the view that Reynolds would have had here on the first day, or Howard, or Buford, when they made the decision, this is the position that has to be held to hold the roads behind us. And it's the position it was determined to fall back to from the defense in depth out west at the McPherson Ridge and Barlow's Knoll, west and north of town. Now the hill, then you could have a view of the whole area. you would have been able to stand here, just take a few steps in that direction in 1863 and have an unbroken view all the way towards the angle. So when soldiers talked about it being the key position, they meant this hill that sort of went on forever. And you and I are able to get a glimpse of that. Now, the actual fight itself, Gary mentioned that Hayes's Louisianans came up this street, where this street is today and where the houses are. The Confederate attack here on the evening of the second day of the battle, July 2nd, 1863, 159 years ago yesterday, was a 1-2 punch, a fixing force and a flanking force. The Southerners were down in a field down there, lying along a ravine or a stream known as Winebrenner Run. The Union defenders here were under Andrew Harris, and they were the 107th Ohio, the 25th Ohio, and then at right angles at the bottom of the hill would have been the 75th Ohio. 107th, 25th, and 75th. There was a 3-tier Union defense, as Gary indicated. The first defense was at the bottom of the hill. If you walk to the bottom of this hill, there's Mr. G's Ice Cream and Alumni Park. It's a beautiful part of town. The Farnsworth House is across the street. You may be walking there later this evening just to shop or to have dinner. But when you get down to the bottom of the hill where the ice cream place is and where the Alumni Park is, the Union had their first defense there. So the Union 11th Corps had defenders down there. They had defenders here, and then they had defenders around the cannons at the top of the hill behind me. So it was a 3-tier defense. That was the case all the way around on the second day of the battle. The Union Army had a 3-tier defense to the west and to the east. To the west, there was the initial defense not far from where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And you remember the Soldiers' National Monument and Lady Liberty there. We said there was a flagpole there when Lincoln spoke. Forward of that ridge facing west would have been the artillery of Thomas Osborne. And they would frown down on Confederates that were down below that would eventually partially attack them under Robert Rhodes on the second day. But below the artillery, in the Taneytown Road where we stood on our first stop up against the wall, that would have been the 136th New York, the 55th Ohio, and those Ohio units and New York units that were there, 73rd Ohio, George Nixon, President Nixon's great-grandfather was there, 73rd Ohio, 55th Ohio, 136th New York, counties just south of Buffalo were in that regiment. They were largely in the Taneytown Road, but the 3-tier defense applied on the west side. They sent troops forward to the Emmitsburg Road. They dismantled fences along the Emmitsburg Road. Today it's called Steinwehr Avenue, named after Adolf von Steinwehr, a German immigrant who had set up an 11th Corps defense there. And then there was another defense beyond that, parallel with it and beyond it, sort of a ripple defense to the west along Fairview Avenue in modern-day Colt Park. So a 3-tier defense to the west, 3-tier defense here to the north, and as we'll see in a few minutes, a 3-tier defense to the east. Now the reason for a 3-tier defense is if you put all your troops in one place, there's nothing to slow down your opponent's advance until the point of contact. If you start your defense right in front of the position you're holding, there's no room for error. You make one mistake and you find yourself, you've lost it, now you have to attack along the reverse slope just to regain what you lost. You want to create cushion. It's called a defense in depth. You set your defenses out in front of where you intend to fall back. Some of you have heard me use this illustration before. Think of the 3-tier defense as metaphoric speed bumps. You go through a Walmart parking lot, there's a speed bump there. If you were to speed, God forbid, you go through there too fast, you might clear those bumps, but it's going to damage the car, the carriage of the car, the suspension. In a similar way, if you create a 3-tier defense on West Cemetery Hill, North Cemetery Hill, and East Cemetery Hill, the Southerners have to deal with each one separately, and each one of them whittles down some of their strength and slows them down like the speed bumps. So by the time they get to their objective, the top of this hill, they're weakened in advance. You're sort of filling the vacuum and making them pay for every inch of ground they take. Does everybody see that? And so that's the way the 11th Corps chose to defend. And that made each line thinner, as Gary pointed out, but it meant that there was resistance at every step that they took. Now there's an account, this is in John Archer's book. Some of you know John Archer. He works for Destination Gettysburg, and he's a guide. He wrote a really good walking tour book here of Cemetery Hill. He's found an interesting quote of an eyewitness that was over near the German Reformed Church in town, down at the bottom of the street and beyond the ice cream place. He watched Hayes's Louisianans charge up the hill. And of course there was no barriers here at the time for line of sight for Charles Wainwright's artillery. And when he fired, the eyewitness looking at it from behind the Confederate lines said he likened what happened to the Confederate soldiers. He compared what happened to the Confederate soldiers to a cart opening and pumpkins rolling out. And you make the connection. Okay, and so it was just a blast. Hayes's men, according to one of the soldiers here in the 107th, just rose up out of the timothy. That's a European term for tall grass. So the Southerners were down there all day, lying flat to the ground in the heat, kind of heat you've endured some of the days here at Gettysburg. And then they just rushed up the hill, and they closed the distance really quick. They were the fixing force. Fixing force is the first force that shows itself in attacks is usually direct. And it draws an inordinate amount of attention for the defender, who has to keep their defensive position, so sometimes the defender will overcommit to stop the first attack. That's the fixing force. You wonder why the 17th Connecticut shifted from facing east to suddenly moving over to facing north, because Hayes's troops showed themselves first. That's what a fixing force does. It gets a defender to overcommit to the first attack. Once the Union forces overcommit here, then the main attack swings around behind them. Does that make sense? One is a right jab. That's Hayes's Louisianans, or a right jab. And that sets up Avery's North Carolinians as a left hook. So the Louisianans are the fixing force. They're the right jab. Avery's North Carolinians coming around, taking the wider circuitous wheel. They're the left hook. And so the first presence of the Confederates would have been against this position. Now, if you read Harry T. Hayes' report, he commanded the Louisianans. He said that when they got to this point of the hill, he talks about abattis and having to remove some of the abattis and climb over into their entrenchments. Abattis is what you used before barbed wire. This is about 20 years before barbed wire. Barbed wire, what you use in World War I, you put it out in the middle of the battlefield in the vacuum in the middle ground to slow down your opponent. Back then, they would take branches off trees like this, and the 107th Ohio would have done this, and you sharpen them like pencils or stakes, and you drive them in the ground. And we can see an indentation here, which it's in the same spot, so it's marking essentially where their fortification would have been. They dug in here. And then the stakes driven in would have made the north side of this hill facing the enemy would have looked like stakes in the ground, or the back of a porcupine. So when the Confederates got here, they could remove these stakes, but that allows the Ohioans to get in 2 or 3 volleys. That might be the difference in breaking the line and its morale being broken or not. So it was to slow them down. Think of the speed bump idea and the 3-tier defense. This was a major point of contention. Now, off to, for most of you, your left, is where Avery would swing around. Hayes drew all the attention first. Think of Hayes' attack like this. Hey! Hey! Look this way! Hayes was trying to get all the Union defenders on East Cemetery Hill under Albert Ames and Andrew Harris to look this way. And then while they were looking at all the noise, Avery was trying to take advantage of the secrecy and come around from behind. Does everybody see that? But we're going to see that the Union responded well to that and shifted over. I'd like to stay here longer and point out some more things. But you've got a sense then of this view, thanks to the Battlefield Trust, of the prominence here on the north side of the hill. Now, we're going to make our way back down to Wainwright Avenue. Notice the Ohio monuments. Let me get to the front, and we're going to make our way gradually over to the side of the... Really the third tier defense. If you count the redoubts at the top of the hill, the lunettes around the cannons, there's really a 4-layered defense, but 3 infantry line defense. And this is your third line of infantry defense. Take a look at the stone wall here. So on the north slope, down at the base of the hill, where the Alumni Park is today, if you'd gone straight down the street that we were looking at and you'd gone north, you would have found their first line of defense at Alumni Park. Second line of defense was where we were just standing. There was Abattis there. The 107th slowed the Confederates down there. The Confederates were able to push through there. They captured, but not without taking losses on their own. And then they got to this wall, and waiting behind it were more members. Again, the 107th, 25th, and 75th were spread out in a 3-tier defense all along the north side of the hill. So members of those Ohio units were waiting there behind the wall. They were lying on their backs, or like so, with their rifles, waiting for the Confederates to cross the wall. And as they lunged forward, they would impale them in the chest. So the fighting was going on too close to dark. That was very unusual during the Civil War. It was going on late in the day. I remember years ago, this is 1988, when I worked at Independence Hall in Philly. My wife worked there too. She remembers this story. There was a person, they had these fences similar to what you saw at the beginning of the tour between the local and the National Cemetery with the little spikes on the end. And outside the Second Bank in Philadelphia, a visitor got their arm, I don't know, it was a young person, they got their arm caught over one of those spikes and they were impaled. And it was a terrible thing, and our law enforcement was called in and they had to work to gradually lift him out to get him to the emergency room. But I thought about that when I was thinking of this. These soldiers, as these Confederates crossed over in a dusky twilight setting, it was their 3rd tier of infantry defense to try to break through. The Ohioans were waiting for them and thrusted their bayonets upward and impaled them. So the Confederates that made it through then circled and went to the top of the hill. Hayes's troops were to try to take on the guns at the top of the hill directly. They went right at, we got a car coming, a truck, and we'll let it pass through, and then we're going to get moving too. Traffic coming, big truck.
Clear the road.
Now behind you is, these trees were not there at the time. They were planted by the Gettysburg High School when the high school used to be where the middle school is. You caught a glimpse of the football field and when we were at the last stop. The high school planted trees here in the 1940s, 50s, and created an environmental center. There's a little pond down there. They dammed up part of Weinbrenner Run, and there's basically a nature reserve. Now, the high school no longer is located here. I don't know whether they even use it anymore, but the woods have grown up around an environmental center that was created maybe 75 years ago. And it blocks our view, but at the time of the fight, this truncated road that you're on now, truncated means it just sort of flattens what would have been a more gradual descent. This road wasn't here, Wainwright Avenue. There was one just below it, or east of it, parallel with it, called Weinbrenner Run Road, or Brickyard Lane, and I'll address that at the next stop. And we'll talk about the Union defenders who met it and how they met it. Okay, so now we're going to walk along the road. Yell out if you see a vehicle. Would have been to the north of us, to the north side of the hill on July 2nd in the evening. That would set up the pivot for Avery's North Carolinians. We called it the left hook, to try to come around a bait and switch, get the Union to look one way and overreact from all the noise of Hayes's Louisianans attacking directly on the north side, and then Avery's North Carolinians sort of sneaking around from the back and taking them in reverse. But of course, the war was 2 years old. This was the 14th major battle. You know, it was difficult to surprise someone back then. Now, I will say there's one thing that's going on different, and that is they fought two-dimensional war versus today we fight three-dimensional war. Today, with drones and airplanes and all kinds of surveillance from above, we can bring even, we can fly jets over and bring firepower from above. That makes it three-dimension to go along with the fighting that's going on the ground, tanks and infantry. That really, the idea of three-dimensional war really took off during World War II with the maturation of the airplane. But during the Civil War, they fought two-dimensional war. Yes, they had some hydrogen balloons on some battlefields, and they would use promontories like Little Round Top with scopes. We would call them telescopes on tripods, with field glasses to watch for enemy campfires, maybe several miles behind enemy lines, or columns of dust, the chalky dust that comes up from dolomite limestone roads. That would give away where your enemy was. You'd send 30 or 40 cavalry out to affirm or debunk what the signal station saw from that promontory. And they did the same thing, did the Union, with balloons down south. So yes, there was some attempt at three-dimension with balloons and with places like Little Round Top. And Cemetery Hill also had a crudely built wood tower somewhere up there that was communicating with flags by day and torches by night with Little Round Top. Okay, and that was going on, but this is the era before smokeless gunpowder by 30 years. So after the first artillery blast, there's a sulfurous smoke in the air, and you can't see from above, even if you're on Little Round Top. Everything is just dark. It's almost like an eclipse of the sun. So three-dimensional warfare was very limited by the technological backwardness that I just described. So when you attacked on the ground in a 1-2 punch, your opponent can't send a drone over you. The Union couldn't send a drone over the Confederates and determine that there were two attacks. One of them had layers to follow through, layers of support to follow through, and the other was just a thin veneer to misdirect, to create a decoy or a deception in the wrong direction. So it's a 50-50 chance the attacker breaks through because the defender, in this case, Aldebert Ames's 11th Corps troops here, formerly Barlow's division, were at ground level, and they don't know whether Hayes's attack has layers of depth to follow through and is the real attack, or whether it's Avery. So they have to guess right. If they guess wrong and they overcommit in the wrong direction, then the attack that finds the least resistance, it breaks through. Can you see that? By the way, if you get that, you understand most Civil War attacks. There's a fixing force, holding force that draws attention, and then there's a flanking force. So, out on the skirmish line was a three-tier defense. Don't want to be redundant, but your first tier defensive infantry would have been in a road parallel with this one. This is Wainwright Avenue. It's improved, built in the early 1900s. There's pulverized stone under it. It was used by Model Ts in the early 1900s. Just beyond that fence of the road, parallel with the current road, was the road then. It was called Brickyard Lane or Weinbrenner Road. It's also sometimes called the Shippensburg Road, because it came from Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, north of here, reached the town square, and then followed along where the fence is today. If you go to the end of this fence line, there's a British marker when Pennsylvania was a colony, before the American Revolution, marking this old road. It was the road to Baltimore, too. So before the Baltimore Pike was built, we just crossed that, the main road to Washington. This is where the Shippensburg Road merged in with the Baltimore Pike to follow the Monocacy River down towards Baltimore and Washington. This is an old English road. It goes way back. Well, the Union used it for a three-tier defense, and in this area was Leopold von Gilsa's troops, 54th New York, 68th New York, and originally the 17th Connecticut, the 153rd Pennsylvania, light blue trousers, dark blue coats, and they had a second tier out there just over the first knoll that you see as a stone wall there. It's not been repaired, it's original. And it was a farmer's wall. You know, these stone walls were put here by farmers. They would clip their hawk's nose or put a ring in their nose so they couldn't root under the fence. They certainly couldn't jump over them. So the Pennsylvania Germans who settled here in the 1740s called all these fences hog-type fences. And so the soldiers would use them to guide on sometimes in attacks, and then other times they would dig a foot behind them and pack the dirt into the wall and create a fortification, kneel down and fire from behind it and use it as a field fortification. Well, there's a stone wall out there, and the 153rd Pennsylvania skirmish line under Clyde Miller was out there. And then all the way out today to what is East Confederate Avenue, 3/4 of a mile from here, was the 41st New York and the 33rd Massachusetts, the 33rd under Colonel Underwood. That was the first point of contact. That was the first metaphoric speed bump. So if you forget everything else tactically today, remember the 11th Corps chose to expand their defense, almost like dropping a pebble in water and you see the ripples go out. That was the 11th Corps defense. They had ripples of defense, layered, to slow the attack gradually, to diminish and degrade it, so by the time it got here, it wouldn't be as formidable. So the Confederates started their attack in the dusk. It was sometime after the cannonade ended, sometime around 6 o'clock. They didn't have daylight saving time. It was dark by 7:15, so this would have been in the twilight. Harry Hayes, who commanded the Louisianians, said later that, he said if the attack had been made by daylight, he said it would have never survived. So the twilight actually helped them have enough of that and the tall Timothy grass and the fact that they rushed so quickly to the top of the hill. Those things, but particularly the darkness, helped them make it to the top of the hill and in and amongst Weidrick's guns at the top of the hill. Brickett's guns, Weidrick's guns, Reynolds, Cooper's guns, all part of Charles Wainwright's 1st Corps artillery defense. Now, the Confederates would have just stood up like a jack-in-the-box from the Henry Culp farm, not even a mile, well, about a mile from here. There was an orchard in that area. They had been lying flat to the ground all day. They just popped up and they fired into the 41st New York and the 33rd Massachusetts out on that furthest 3rd tier defense. Got them to fall back, and then as the Confederates followed on their heels, they got to the 2nd layer of defense where Clyde Simmons' 153rd skirmish line was there in their light blue trousers, dark blue coats. Clyde Simmons fired into them to try to slow them down. The 3 North Carolina regiments, from my left to right, 6th North Carolina under Major Tate, and then in the middle the 21st North Carolina, and on my far right, Archibald Godwin's 57th North Carolina. They were making a swinging motion while the Union was looking that way. But the skirmish line caught them. It was almost like a 19th century smoke alarm, and the Southerners went across a tripwire, and the alarm bells were going off that the attack was coming. So the Union defenders that were here behind this line, the main defense, and then Wainwright's guns firing over their heads up here, they knew the attack must be getting close. Suddenly, Clyde Miller of the 153rd Pennsylvania jumped over the fence of Brickyard Lane, and he had a message to give to Leopold von Gilsa, who commanded the brigade down here. And he told him, he said, they're right on our heels. And there might have been a language barrier. Von Gilsa was originally from Germany. He had fought in the Schleswig-Holstein conflict, German unification efforts in 1848, which failed at Frankfurt then and caused a lot of disillusioned Germans to come to the New World. He had worked in New York City. He played a piano in the evening at what was called the Pippin Fest in the Bowery. He also did school teaching, but as soon as the war broke out, he joined Franz Siegel's 11th Corps and became part of this larger German immigrant corps that would defend here on the 2nd day. Maybe there was some problem with an English translation or whatever, but he didn't quite understand what Miller was telling him, that they're right over that little ridge. And of course, people wonder, why wouldn't von Gilsa just accept Miller's word? It's because he was probably caught off guard. They were hit so hard in this direction. He was probably thinking that's the main attack. Secondly, it was getting dark. Third, if you've walked this field with myself or another ranger or guide on your own, you know just beyond this little ridge, there's a slight little ridge, not a whole lot to look at from here, but just beyond it, an average height person disappears. So the Confederates wouldn't have been visible at the last minute. And while von Gilsa and Miller were talking, and Miller was trying to convince him, the Southerners suddenly just, again, like a jack-in-the-box, popped up out of the ground. It was too late then. And it cost the 41st New York way over to my right, 33rd Massachusetts, the 68th New York, 54th New York, 153rd Pennsylvania to fall back to the top of the hill. And as they fell back to the top of the hill, fighting occurred in and amongst the guns. So I'm going to take you up there for the conclusion. Again, advantage here numerically. They had around 23 to 2,400. The Union only had about 1,100 defenders here. But that's the point of an echelon attack. Longstreet's attack, it hit the Union left so hard down in the area of the Peach Orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, that General Meade threw the kitchen sink at his left flank. And Sickles advancing a third of his army too far contributed to maybe disproportionately more troops being sent to the left. The Southerners that were to attack the apex of the Union line, Cemetery Hill and off to my left, Culp's Hill, they were told to look for opportunities on their front of troops leaving here to go down there. And over 8,000 Union troops left the center. You know this, Caldwell's entire division left the center, Cemetery Ridge, to go help at the wheat field to help out Sickles. That is their 2nd Corps troops. And the 71st Pennsylvania, 106th Pennsylvania, 72nd Pennsylvania at the famous angle on July 3rd, they left the angle to help here or Culp's Hill, depending on which regiment we're talking about. Carroll's brigade, which is also facing on the west side of the hill, shifted over here too. And Willard's brigade left Ziegler's Grove to march down to stop Barksdale in the area of what is today United States Avenue and the George Weichert Farm. I counted up the numbers once. Over 8,000 Union troops left the center. That's Cemetery Ridge, where Pickett's charge would strike on July 3rd. Left the center on July 2nd. No wonder the Southerners thought that would be vulnerable on the 3rd day. They left to go to the flank. And so the Southerners that were attacking around the bend and the fishhook were told that was going to happen. Look for that opportunity, and the moment that happened, it would trigger this 3-prong attack. Johnson's division would attack Culp's Hill first. Jubal Early would attack East Cemetery Hill second with Hayes and Everett. And then Robert Rhodes was to attack thirdly and sequentially from the west along West Cemetery Hill where we began. It was a 3-prong attack, and they were to wrap around like a wrench around a bolt. They were going to try to squeeze this point. It's called a pincer maneuver. Longstreet's attack was supposed to be attacking up the Emmitsburg Road to join them so the entire Confederate Army's critical mass would be here. They wanted to squeeze the Union Army here, but leave a way open and hope the Union Army would retreat down this road. They had 5,000 cavalry beyond that hill that you see out there, Wolf Hill, under Jeb Stuart. Opposing them would be General Custer of Little Bighorn fame 13 years later. Opposing them would be David Gregg and his cavalry as well. They were clogging access roads to this Baltimore Pike further south. Had this pocket collapsed at Cemetery Hill from the 3-prong attack, and the Union had started down that road, there were 30,000 horses and mules between here, and many of them south of Union Mills, 14 miles south. Some of them here, some of them there, pulling ambulances, ordnance wagons, artillery vehicles. If this pocket had collapsed and everybody, Pickett's charge was to overrun the Taneytown Road. Keep in mind the importance of roads. That would have reduced, by Sickles losing the Emmitsburg Road on the 2nd day, and then Pickett's troops taking Taneytown Road on the 3rd day by breaking through Cemetery Ridge, that would leave only one way out and the whole army trying to retreat on one road with Stuart's cavalry trying to intercept the wagon train. Very cruel and tragic, but if they'd been able to get there and there had been a fallback, you approach your horses, they would have shot the horses, they would have set fire to the wagons, and so you try to create panic behind the lines and try to get that metastasized during a retreat. Everybody's stuck in a traffic jam. That was the plan, and everything was to collapse here. So the closest that the Confederates ever got to breaking through and collapsing this bend in the fishhook was on the evening of July 2nd, which we focused on. The first attack hit Culp's Hill. Think of the Union line. I'm trying to reach the right brain learners. Lisa, I haven't forgotten. Think of the Union fishhook as an A-frame tent. Think of the ropes that pull it taut and keep it up, and the stakes driven in the ground. The stakes in the ground that keep the tent taut and standing. Think of the stakes as Culp's Hill on the Union right flank and Little Round Top on the Union left flank. When the Southerners attacked Little Round Top and Culp's Hill, they were metaphorically trying to pull a stake out of the ground to get the Cemetery Hill tent to collapse. Can you see that? So the Southerners were over there metaphorically fighting for hours, 4 hours, trying to pull a stake out of the ground. So they would have access to the wagon trains and access to the Baltimore Road, bridges south of here, between here and the Maryland border. So Pep Green, a wonderful engineer, built fortifications over there, did so brilliantly, and staved off the attack. He was outnumbered. But Johnson's attack would have been really loud, and all that rattling over there would have drawn attention. Then Hayes suddenly appeared here with his Louisianans in their gray and butternut uniforms, and they fought with these battery commanders, Wydrick and Ricketts and Reynolds and Cooper, in some cases hand to hand. Simmers, who was the historian for the 153rd Pennsylvania, he said the men were using, the rammers that you use to load a charge in the cannon. They were wielding them as bats, he said. They were also using stones and knives, anything to inflict pain, unquote. So the fighting was brutal. It was dark. The only way they could see each other was by the flash of the muzzle. If you've ever been in a place where there's a strobe light and you see someone and then you don't see them, and of course your pupils dilate when you're in the dark to try to find whatever light there is, and then a sudden flash causes you to see blue dots. It would have been that kind of effect. Adrenaline is rushing through the body, cortisol and adrenaline to the brain, fight or flight. But in this fighting, in and amongst the guns, with the infantry having fallen back to fight, the 11th Corps was holding. But as a good pool player thinks 3 or 4 shots ahead, Hancock released the 2nd Corps from Cemetery Ridge, the 2nd Corps' brigade, Samuel Carroll's brigade. They call him the Gibraltar Brigade. He came over with his auburn-colored beard and curly auburn mustache, and he led his Gibraltar Brigade right through there, the 14th Indiana, 4th and 8th Ohio. They came rushing over, light blue trousers, dark blue coats, and they joined the 11th Corps and caused the Confederates to have to retreat. It was a full moon that night, and under the full moon, the Southerners could see the pale faces of their wounded and dead in the fields that they had just crossed on the way back. It was a moment that Harry T. Hayes writes about in his official report. He was with the Louisianans. He said that there was a sudden flash of light all along where this fence line is here along the Baltimore Pike, a sudden flash of light. And some of his men were getting hit here in the darkness, falling, wounded, in and amongst the guns. They were also friendly fire. It's no way that they couldn't have also hit some of their own men. But as that was going on, Hayes said, I wouldn't let my men fire in that direction because we had been cautioned to expect friends from that direction. Ken, that goes back to your point. Robert Rhodes was the 3rd prong of the attack. He was supposed to come in to join from the west, where we began our tour, with Early, who was coming in from the north, and from the east, and also Johnson, who was coming in from the east. Rhodes didn't complete the attack. They started and then decided not to, in part because Union artillery frowned down on them. Also, from Cemetery Hill on its western side, the Confederates would have approached West Cemetery Hill and they would have been staring right into 38 cannon at least. Also, Longstreet's attack was stopped so thoroughly in the area of the Peach Orchard that they were a good mile from Rhodes's right flank. He didn't feel comfortable attacking with his right flank having a gap of nearly a mile. You say, well, Richard Anderson was out, but Richard Anderson didn't complete his attack. So there was a gap in the line. Rhodes was uncomfortable advancing without troops advancing up the Emmitsburg Road close to his right flank. So Rhodes didn't complete the attack. That allowed Union troops to shift over from the west side of the hill to the east side, north side of the hill, and repulse the attack. So those who retreated down to the base of the hill, when they got to the bottom of the hill, Louisiana, North Carolina, they were very upset. They had been promised that Gordon's Georgians would join the fight, but a decision had made at some point that they weren't able to break through. So that would be the closest that the Confederates ever got to collapsing the pocket here that we called Cemetery Hill. So to pull it all together in conclusion, David Wills wrote Governor Curtin a couple of months after the battle, and He said, "I'd like to purchase 17 acres of Cemetery Hill, fronting on the Baltimore Pike and extending to the Tawny Town Road. It was the apex of our triangle line of battle. It was the key to our line of defenses. It was the spot above all others." Thank you for coming out for the 159th this week. Thank you, and law enforcement's down there to help you cross the road. If you're parked that way, if you're parked Stevens Knoll, just retrace your steps down that stone wall. Stevens Knoll's over there to the right, depending on where you park.
See you at 3 o'clock.